goals and objectives we've drafted.
Sorry, Ryan.
No problem. We'll go over the goals and objectives that we've drafted with city staff, but we want to make sure we got those right and get your input on them. And then we're also going to go through our understanding of existing conditions for all transportation modes being walking, cycling, driving, taking the bus, any way you might get around Cannon Beach. And then we'll close with next steps and talk about timing for our next meeting. Next slide, please. So what is a transportation system plan? Generally, most communities in Oregon have a transportation system plan as required by state law. TSPs address transportation needs now that exist on the ground, but also into the future. So with this process, we're going to be looking out 20 years and forecasting the future in terms of future population and transportation needs to understand what we'll need to do in the future too, to make sure that the transportation system still works for everyone. And at the end of the day, when we're done with this process, the TSP is going to contain projects, for example, new sidewalks or intersection treatments, programs. So programs are things that aren't necessarily built on the ground, but for example, parking management, which we'll talk about more at this meeting and others as well. And then also policies. So the city's already got robust transportation policy on the books, but we want to take a fresh look at it and make sure it's up to date. And then finally, we'll also talk about standards. Standards being things like what is the standard street improvements that might be required of developers when new building comes in. And also, as Jeff mentioned, that this will be the city's first TSP. So we're starting from square one in some respects. Next. So as I mentioned, the TSP, we're going to look at everything, right? It's all of the ways of getting around. So walking, driving, biking, riding the bus, freight too, and then also parking. And already we know this process is going to focus in particular on transportation ideas, whether those are projects, programs, or standards, that preserve the village feel and are really tailored for the Cannon Beach context. And the other really important piece of this is balancing the needs of the people who live year-round in Cannon Beach and those who do business in Cannon Beach, but also the visitors. So balancing how we address the transportation impacts from all of those different groups. So again, and we'll go over these in just a second. We'll start with goals and objectives because those really guide us through the rest of the process. They set the foundation for understanding what kinds of solutions we'll be putting in the TSP, whether they do or don't meet our goals and objectives. We'll then develop projects and programs that address the needs that we're going to talk about today. And then we also look towards implementation. We don't want to create a menu of projects and programs without figuring out how we might fund these projects. And then finally, there's also some updates that we have planned for the city code. One, just to make sure we're complying with state law, and then anything else we might want to consider as a result of this process. So what's your role in all this? As I said, this group has a really important advisory role for the TSP. So, Eddie and Owen and I are the consultants on this project, and we are here to provide our best advice and recommendations to you and to the city and to the public more broadly. But this is really a community plan. So we provide recommendations, and we want your input and feedback on what's right for Cannon Beach throughout this whole process. We'll also be talking with, at a couple of key points, the Planning Commission specifically, And then also checking in with the city council as they're the ultimate approvers and adopters of the TSP. And then a couple things quickly on schedule. We actually started back in January. So we've been doing a lot of background kind of research and assembling the information that we're going to present here today. And very soon, actually, I believe we're launching today, we're going to have an online open house. And we also have a webinar this evening. We'll talk about this again at the end to launch our first stage of public outreach. Later this summer, we'll come back to this group and the public to talk about what we call here alternatives analysis, which is, how are we going to solve the transportation issues? What are the different ideas for solving these issues? In the fall, we'll come back with a refined list of those solutions, and then early next year, we'll have assembled all of this into a transportation plan for your review. So before we go to goals and objectives, and I'll turn it over to Eddie, who's my co-lead on this project. Are there any questions, comments from folks before we move on about the process overall? Okay, cool. I will hand it over to Eddie.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And again, Eddie Montejo, transportation planner, supporting this effort. So now I'd like to walk you all through the goals and objectives that we've developed for this project. And then following that, we'll get into some of the more meatier topics related to our first major piece of work for the TSP, which is the existing conditions analysis. So next slide, please, Jeff. So to preface the discussion, we wanted to run some questions by you all to be thinking about as you review the information. So we'll have an opportunity at the end to come back to these questions, but again, just so that you're thinking about them, are these the right goals? Is there anything missing based on your experience living, working, operating a business in Cannon Beach? And is there anything that we should add or change? So let's get into it. Next slide, please. So at a high level, there are 4 goals that we've identified. The first being preserving Cannon Beach's coastal village charm. Number 2 being balancing the needs of different transportation system users throughout the community. Like Ryan mentioned, there are obviously many different types of transportation users, so balancing their needs is going to be important. Enhancing safety and emergency preparedness. And lastly, fostering a sustainable transportation system. And the next slides really just kind of break these down into the objectives that serve each of these goals. So for preserving Cannon Beach's coastal village charm, we've talked with the city preliminarily about this a lot, and we understand that this is a critical component of ensuring that the TSP is reflective of the values of the community members. So in the essence of that, we'll develop transportation projects and programs that complement the natural and cultural context of Cannon Beach. And we're also going to do our best to scale the investments that the TSP recommends in a way that is consistent with the scale of the village context. Another critical element of this is balancing the city's vibrant tourism economy with the needs of year-round visitors and business owners. And of course, also balancing those needs with transportation-related impacts from the tourism economy. And lastly, an important element to this is addressing the major north-south transportation spine through this area, which is of course US 101. And that is preserving the function of US 101 for regional traffic while enhancing the function and safety of connections between the city and the highway. Next slide, please. All right, so for goal 2, balancing the needs of different transportation system users. The first objective is related to managing parking to make best use of what's out there today and addressing potential parking capacity before considering new parking areas. Number 2 is enhancing safety and comfort for people walking and cycling from one neighborhood to another. And third is ensuring the system continues to serve local freight needs, which is of course very important to supporting the local economy. All right, for number 3, enhancing safety and emergency preparedness. This is important. So developing a connected network of cycling and walking routes and enhancing access to transit. And what this is getting at is providing multiple options for people to get to safety areas and congregation spots for people on foot or on bike. Addressing known safety problems, limiting points of access and respecting the scenic corridor along US 101, and continuing to build resiliency linking coasts to range by maintaining lifeline links and evacuation routes. And lastly, fostering a sustainable transportation system, coordinating transportation improvements with city land use planning and new development, preserving and maintaining the existing system and managing demands on the system before making new investments, maintaining acceptable traffic flow and operations to minimize citywide delay, avoiding transportation impacts to Ecola Creek, the shoreline, wetlands, and other natural features, and prioritizing projects that can be funded by grants and looking for partnership opportunities with other agencies and groups, which we'll get into a little bit more in subsequent slides.
Hey, Eddie.
So, yeah.
Eddie, Elisa Phipps has her hand raised.
Oh, okay. Well, perfect timing because we're actually at the discussion section. So please take it away.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I should have known that was coming up.
That's okay, Lisa.
And there's no chat function. Otherwise, I would have just typed it so that I didn't interrupt anyway.
No worries.
So in the discussion about the multimodal aspects of transportation, I'm guessing this is inherent in the conversation, but I just, this is really my first full TSP. So maybe this is always part of it, but where does the discussion about accessibility come in? So different levels of ability to use sidewalks and whatnot. So wheelchairs, that type of thing. Where is that ever explicitly stated, or is that sort of implied and then it comes out in the project development phase?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lisa. So I think I don't want to say it's implicit because we probably should be more explicit about it, perhaps in these goals. So maybe that's a recommendation that we consider. But typically for any of the multimodal elements that we would be looking at, whether it's sidewalk facilities, bicycle facilities, improving access to transit, and so forth, accessibility is always it's always a critical consideration in how we design and develop concepts for those kinds of facilities. So it's certainly something that would get incorporated into any project that we recommended on the multimodal system. Does that answer your question or?
Yeah, it does. It struck me as being so obviously not included. And so I just wondered, how it would be perceived from a public perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Hey, Eddie, could I add one thing here?
Yeah, of course.
Lisa, TSP goals, there's multiple ways we've tackled these before, but with these, we've really tried to capture them in an understandable and relatable way. And sometimes my fear is, when we have goals that refer to, accessibility, connectivity, mobility, that those terms can be a little opaque for people. And so, we've got an objective here that's enhanced safety and comfort for people walking and cycling. And so, like Eddie says, I think it is implicit in there that we want to increase accessibility and mobility for those modes. But as you know, we could say that more explicitly. We tried to err on the side of making them a little bit more plain language and relatable.
Okay. If I had a disability, I would want it to be relatable to me. But at the same time, I understand what you're saying. And like I said, obviously it's part of it's one of the lenses everything gets reviewed under, in terms of sidewalks and improvements. And I totally understand that. It was just something caught my attention. I didn't mean to hijack the conversation around it.
Yeah.
No, not at all, Lisa. I think that's a really useful piece of feedback, and we'll definitely take that back to the drawing board and see if there's a meaningful way that we can incorporate language around that.
Yeah, and I think that Gail also has her hand raised. We'll let Gail.
Okay, yeah, my question's similar to Lisa's, and I've never done a TSP either. So my question though is, so are you going to be looking at the demographics of your resident population and the demographics of your tourist population? And then if those demographics kind of gear you off to potentially conflicting projects, how are you going to resolve those conflicts?
And hey, I'll take this one first. Gail, it's also a very good question. And you know, in the work for the TSP, and I don't, we're going to have to balance throughout the needs of visitors versus local residents, regardless of demographics, right? Because we don't want to necessarily develop a TSP that is, you know, too heavily weighted towards addressing every visitor impact, right? There's lots of reasons we don't necessarily want to do that, and that we might want to find other ways of mitigating visitor impacts, regardless of demographic, right? I would say that in terms of the focus of the TSP and the needs is more related to the demographics of the people living in Cannon Beach specifically. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and can I just say something, this Jeff? I think one of the things on that, I think about that daily, Gil. It's, our resident population, I came from working mainly in resort areas, but also all military communities that were part of military communities. So a demographic that was way younger than the one that I'm working in with resident populations. But I do think that we've had kind of a history of some ADA kind of compliance issues, and we need to update our public facilities on that. So we're always looking towards that. So it is something that I think we do need to explicitly think about in every kind of improvement decision. And I think you err always on the side of universal kind of design. In other words, we make it accessible to the grandparents and the kids with strollers. And that way you're always erring on that side. And so I think our older demographic that is our true maybe focus or base of most of our decisions. If we're designing for that, I think it picks up the younger demographic that I think is our seasonal influx design. There are points I think where that will conflict, and it does. Especially when you get into the funding streams. But I think that to do what Lisa and Gail spoke about, to think about the ADA and those that need those kind of transition environments, keep that as the main focus or the main target of all decisions. I think that we can only improve our infrastructure. Michael, would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. Let me just unraise my hand there. Yeah, so no, a great discussion, great point, Lisa. And without getting too much into like wordsmithing what we have here, but I think something simple as for all users and abilities as like an add-on to one of these goal statements there, kind of speaks to that, and certainly would kind of I think seeks to cover folks that have mobility devices or are aging and have mobility challenges. And I think that's a great point too. Especially when we think of in terms of aging in place, and folks that have been living here in the community for a long time, and their expectation is that they're able to live and move and go to all the places that they want to within Cannon Beach. The other point too, as Gail mentioned, there's when we have a little bit more discussion around evaluation criteria, I think there's an opportunity with how we reflect that in our criteria and kind of how we weight things to make sure that how we will eventually evaluate the proposed projects, programs, policies, et cetera, as part of this effort, that they certainly reflect the needs of the community and the folks that are in and visiting the community too. So that's all. And oh, one last thing, and just a nuts and bolts point, in our scope of work, which is, I don't know, 60 pages long or something like that. It's a long, awful thing that only us folks get to deal with, but it gets very detailed in some of the things that we are looking at. And I just wanted to mention that ADA is certainly evident and prioritized within, our inventory and summaries and what we're looking at in that work. And so it will be reflected in the final project outcomes. But I think it's a great point to, when we have outward facing information such as our goals and objectives, to make sure there's a nod to that community in there as well. So thank you.
All right, Eddie.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that as a time check, we had allocated an additional 15 minutes to talk about this. So we're not in a rush in any way. So if folks want to ask more questions about the goals, please feel free. Otherwise, we can move on to the next section. All right. And I apologize, Jeff. I'm not seeing the hands and stuff. So assuming the silence means we're good to go.
Yeah, I don't see any others as well.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, let's move on to the next topic. So like I mentioned, we really envision this to be the bulk of the conversation today. So the system inventory and existing conditions is really the first major piece of work for the TSP. So it's where we essentially take stock of all of the transportation facilities in town, look at the conditions today, and essentially develop a list of needs to inform the rest of the process. So again, just so you have these in the back of your mind as I present, do these conditions resonate with your impression or experiences of the transportation system in Cannon Beach? What's working well for you or your visitors well now? What's one thing that you'd like to change? Of course, what issues or needs do you see? And is there anything missing from our analysis? Slide. All right, so to kick things off, the street network, which is of course the sort of the skeleton for the entire transportation network. And I should preface this by saying that, of course, the actual memo, the memorandum that we developed for this is quite long. So this is just a snapshot. So this is in no way comprehensive of everything that we found, but here are just a few findings. So the first is that, the city really does have strong local policies in place to preserve that village aesthetic. And as a result of that, most of the streets today are narrow and without sidewalks. And in addition, you probably all know that Cannon Beach also currently doesn't have any traffic signals. We also found a few places where street width standards are not being met. For example, Beach Street does not meet those standards north of First Street. And generally in terms of vehicle mobility, we didn't find that this was a huge problem in town. But of course, we do know there are traffic issues, especially in the commercial areas and at peak visitor times. And there are a few places where we're seeing persistent queuing. So for example, westbound traffic at the intersection of East 5th Street and First Street is expected to back up past the intersection with Beach Street if left unimproved into the future. Next slide, please. And building from this, again, US 101, the major north-south transportation corridor that links all the cities on the coast, has been similarly impacted by local policy. So city policies have preserved this corridor as a 2-lane forested corridor. And the city has also made it a priority to minimize commercial development adjacent to the corridor and limiting the number of access points onto the highway. And currently, US 101 does not meet spacing standards for accesses, which would make it difficult to justify new connection points onto the highway. All right, and for the next...
Sorry, I have one quick thing too, is that the city has had longstanding policy that aims to preserve 101 as a forested, more undeveloped corridor. So.
Right, thanks, Ryan. And actually for this next section, I'm gonna hand it off to my colleague Owen to talk about some of the parking findings that we have. So Owen, do you wanna take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. So yeah, parking. With the parking, we wanted to kind of evaluate what, as part of the existing conditions report, we wanted to take a look at what Cannon Beach has in terms of assets, and where they're located and what the on-street system is like versus the off-street system. And when you look at parking management in general, particularly in an area that has a lot of activity, is that you really do want to try to balance the system, or I should say the trick is really to balance the system between the needs of both visitors and residents who drive into the downtown. In particular instance with Cannon Beach, we really do want to try to maintain that village aesthetic along with it. And so one thing I like to say about communities that we do work in is that you want a parking problem. A parking problem is an example of a bustling downtown, of a community that has a lot of activity going on in it. And so contrary to what one might think, is that having a parking problem means that your downtown is doing well. And so that is that's actually one of the things that you're striving for. And I say that a little flippantly, but there are lots of ways to manage parking, and we'll get into those in the future. But today we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the broader findings in terms of inventory and just some of the different aspects of what we looked at in the downtown. So we are in the process of doing this study. We looked at over 2,260 stalls were part of the inventory work, and that includes both downtown and midtown. So we were looking at both on-street and off-street facilities in the downtown, as well as the area around City Hall and that the commercial area in Midtown. And not surprisingly to you that most of these stalls, almost all of them, have no sort of time restrictions of any kind. So it's just free all day parking. And that has pluses and minuses to it as well. One of the things that was apparent to us in doing the inventory work in the downtown was the signage and the street striping, whether it's curb painting or some of the striping of stalls, that they tend to be inconsistent from place to place. And then also the lack of maybe some of the street striping in some of the busier areas like along Hemlock and others would be advantageous to have for folks coming in, because one of the things we saw is kind of haphazard parking along Hemlock, and specifically that if we had striping on that street, you would have potentially a lot more capacity just from simple stall striping. So let's go to the next slide. Well, I have, are you ready to move on?
So Jeff, I think there might be a couple of slides that are hidden in the parking section.
Yeah, sorry, I must have the wrong one up. Hey,
no, I think I had them hidden just to make sure we were good with the content.
Okay, so do you want to go to the walking now, or back to parking, or?
Well, we have time, and I think it's an important topic, so I think it would be good to show the parking slides, if that's okay.
Okay, let me see if I.
Yeah, Jeff, you back out of the presentation and just right click. It's like show slide or.
Oh, okay, let me see.
Yeah, there they are.
That's what it is, okay. So.
Yeah, and then. Yeah, where it says hide slide, just click that and it'll unhide it.
Oh,
there we go.
Got it.
Awesome.
Sorry about that. All right.
All right, great. Thanks, Jeff. So these are just examples. This is kind of our inventory of the off-street supply. Obviously, the left is downtown and the right is midtown, but this gives you an example of all of the sites, and we call them sites or facilities that we looked at. And this is when I use the term inventory, that basically means that we just went through and cataloged all of the parking within these study areas. And so we're looking at mostly commercial stuff. Sometimes we'll even look at like multifamily residential, but that is not the primary emphasis. Is commercial parking of any kind, and that's not what we did. And you can, if you look carefully, I don't know, it is kind of small, but we try to catalog them by sector. So institutional, mixed use, office, that type of thing. Those determinations were made by our surveyors, and they're by no means, they're very, one could argue one way or the other. We just try to put them in some sort of interpretive category just to provide kind of a context for the type of parking that we saw as observers in the system. And so that's all that the colorations kind of signify in this area. So in both of these areas. So next slide.
Owen, just to clarify, you made this point previously, but some of these spaces are private spaces, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, this is there is some significant public supply in here, which is kind of the light rose colored. But other than that, the majority of this parking is in private control. And so what we're trying to do when we go through and we do an inventory, we're just trying to catalog everything that's there for one. And then we go back and we will do a sample of determining what occupancies are like in a lot of these off-street facilities. And some are public, some are private, just to get a sense. And so to get a true sense of how the system is operating, it's important that we capture both of those things. But this is not necessarily a complete reflection of where data has been collected. So just wanted to make that clear as well. So next slide. This, on the other hand, does show where some of the data has been collected. And so on the left, we've got, and we did 2 days worth. We did a weekday and a weekend. So where we're coming in and looking at the on-street system, it shows the areas of red show constraint. And basically it's over 85%. And then there's varying colors. The warmer the color, the more activity, the cooler the color, the yellows and greens represent lower activity. And this is the on-street system representing those bars for occupancies on block faces in the downtown. On the right, the colors also apply, and these are the off-street samples that we did in the downtown area. And in the on-street supply, there's 30% of the block faces are constrained, and then in the off-street system, we had like 17% of the off-street facilities were constrained. Now, what that means is just the face value. In other words, we're not talking about individual stalls here. We're just talking about 17% of the off-street facilities are constrained, and you can just kind of see where they are. And these change too, by the way. This is a snapshot in time. So on the left, you'll see it's the peak hour for the on-street system, which is noon to 1 during the weekday. And then on the right, you see it's a weekend peak hour for the off-street from 2 to 3 p.m. There's going to be a lot more detail about this in the memo, but this is just kind of an overview of what we have so far. Next slide. And similarly, Midtown, we did the same, and looking at the Midtown weekday peak hour for on-street is between 2 and 3 p.m. And 44% of the block faces are constrained there. We also know there's a fair amount of blocks that don't have any parking on them. So there's less on-street availability here. In the downtown, we have over 400 stalls that we looked at. In Midtown, there was only 200 on-street spaces, or 215. And then if you look at the off-street supply, only 13% of the off-street facilities have any sort of constraint associated with them during their peak hour, which is later in the day, which probably is not too much of a surprise for you. But on the weekend, it's between 4 and 5 p.m. which is kind of a transition time between when people are returning to their hotels and people are just getting off work. And so you'll see kind of that overlap, and which is why we see some of that translated in those occupancies during that 4 to 5 p.m. hour.
Oh, and just real fast, we're getting some background noise. If folks who mute, not speaking, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Owen. So I think that was the last parking slide, if I'm not mistaken.
It sure isn't. The one, sorry, Eddie, one more thing, and then we can talk about it too further. There is one of the person that dialed in.
I think,
phone.
Yeah, Jen, can you mute, please? Oh, thank you.
Great. And we can talk about this as if it's a question, but in terms of the methodology that we used in going through how we set up the inventory and the data collection piece, there's a pretty robust information in terms of industry best practices when it comes to parking management and how we collect data. And so we're following those guidelines very strictly. Rick Williams Consulting was one of the firms that actually created the guidelines for the state of Oregon. So on the state of Oregon website, we created a primer that's called Parking Made Easy, and it's a guide to your parking management in your community. And we use exactly that methodology to how we go about sampling and determining part of the study area and how we go about frequency of data collection, et cetera. So using industry best practices with all of this stuff. So now I'll turn it back to Eddie on that.
And actually, before we go on, I was going to suggest, because we're presenting a lot of information here. I wanted to ask if there was any comments, observations from the group about traffic issues, which Eddie talked a little bit about, and some of the parking conditions that Owen's team have found. I see Barb and Gail's hands up. Barb?
I would just like to ask if we could get those 2 slides that show the parking data sent to us, because those weren't in the original packet.
Yeah, and I can speak to that, Barb. We got those yesterday evening, but I have, and what we will do from now on is every time I speak in public, you're going to say CannonBeachTSP.com. Everything that we've got, I'm going to put it there and upload all this kind of information. Will be the latest that we have will be put up there as soon as I get it, okay? And then it's been verified. So I've already put that most recent. Now, I can't guarantee it because just recently, Barb, on this, they said they had hid those 3 slides. So I will verify that as soon as I get out of this meeting. But yeah, we'll put those up on our website at CannonBeachTSP.com. But I will also send, after every meeting that we have, the presentation that was sent and any materials that were to our pack. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up was Gail.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is there any information about who is using the parking spaces that are getting to especially the on-street, the constrained areas? Is it business owners who are using the on-street parking, or is it people coming from one portion of town and then leaving their private parking lot, driving to a different part of town, parking on the street instead of being able to walk or bike? Do we know any of that information?
We don't explicitly know that information, but we can make some sort of educated guesses based on how long people are staying in their parking spaces. So if somebody is staying for over 5 hours, we think it's fairly likely that that's either somebody who's working in downtown or potentially a resident, although in some of the areas I would be surprised if residents are parking on major commercial streets with all commercial frontage. So typically we default to that being, a telltale sign of an employee parking on street for that long. And we have some data about that we will share it. It's part of the existing condition summary. So that information is in there, but in terms of exactly knowing who it is without sitting there and watching, them arrive and where they walk into, it's more difficult to make that determination.
Owen, on that note, this is Jeff, because I had this come up at my planning commission or DRB meeting, one of my most recent meetings. They had asked a similar question in that, in other words, when you collect this data, will you collect tag information? In other words, can you say in town or out of town, or at least in state or out of state kind of thing?
We to help determine how long a vehicle has been parked in a specific place, we do take license plates, and so that's part of the utilization study. What we don't distinguish. We only have anecdotal information about where they're from. So we're not saying that this person's from Florida and this person's from California, this one's from Washington. So we don't have that grain of detail associated with it, but we have lots of anecdotal evidence from the survey crew about where they're from. When I was out there, I was really impressed with the number of Washington residents. When I was out there, I would say that there's a significant number on a particular day that we were out. There was a lot of Washington plates that I noticed, but they're from all over too. Cannon Beach is clearly a destination for a lot of folks. So.
Yeah, and so I'm a data kind of geek, and so I have a habit.
Good for you.
Yeah, I have a habit of doing a automatic sampling. I run as well, and so I run the community all the time, and so I have this kind of habit of saying Oregon, Washington, or other, and it's usually interesting about a third of each whenever I do that kind of thing. So. I think that what we're getting is, quite a bit of Washington in this area. But I will now ask Brandon. Brandon's got his hand raised.
Thank you. Yes, I guess my question's along the lines of Gail's, but when you spoke about best practices, my question is, do those best practices skew more towards communities that are more residential or, geared towards people that primarily live and work in the communities versus a community like ours that has a large vacation component to it?
Yeah, let me see if I can unwrap that a little. Best practices, it doesn't really reflect necessarily on the type of community it is, because there are, best practices kind of apply to all types of parking. What I would say is, so what we try to do is the methodology that we use is intended to extract as empirical a data as we can in terms of how the parking system is being used. And it doesn't differentiate between resident, visitor, or customer. It does give us a little bit of information or insights about each of those user groups based on behavior. But what really applies, I think, to what you're saying is that when we look forward to potential strategies or solutions, they are much different for a visitor than they are for, say, a resident or that bedroom community component. And so strategies that would be implemented in certain areas are more reflective of the adjacent land uses. So in a commercial corridor, we would have specific strategies that would address customers and visitors. In one of those fringe areas, we would have strategies that try to balance the needs of both some turnover for visitor use, but also preserve the need and access for residents and vacation rental folks, that type of thing. Hopefully that answers your question a little.
Thank you, Owen. It went exactly to the point that I was trying to make and didn't articulate very well. But I had one other question, but it fit in for the slide that involved the 101 corridor, and there wasn't a question period after that. And it was just about the spacing standards. It doesn't allow for connection points. And I was just wondering if you could, because we have some upcoming issues with possibility of connecting to 101 in the future, or the distant future, and how that may fit into the TSP.
I'll take that one. Maybe also provide an opportunity for Michael to comment with ODOT. But you know, maybe I think it's fair to say that it's not that we're not saying that a new connection isn't possible or couldn't be justified. It's more that when looking at the number of accesses per distance per mile based on the type of highway it is, that the current number of accesses don't meet state standards. So at the end of the day, there would have to be more work, more justification done to justify any new access to 101. Michael, do you want to elaborate or?
No, I mean, that kind of covers it. I mean, and you know, I'm sorry I haven't been part of those prior discussions. I know that there's, you know, been ongoing for probably years now, talks about access to that property. But I think what, you know, Ryan's statement is probably, you know, fair and good and a sensible approach. Certainly something that you'd want to capture as far as existing conditions, just so the community and folks involved in this effort are all on the same page as far as considerations, constraints with regards to access, spacing, you know, and or interchange spacing to kind of differentiate between those two, but because there are different spacing standards there.
Brandon, does that answer your questions there, or?
Yeah, for now, just to move the conversation on, I just wanted to get exactly what they said. Thank you.
Okay. Les, I think you had your hand raised next.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I had a real quick question about the scope of the study because there wasn't any data presented for anything south of Midtown, but I think I saw on that last slide that the study area does go all the way down to the south entrance off of 101. And just, is that correct?
It does for the parking study doesn't, but the transportation, the TSP goes down all the way to the city limits. Yes.
Okay, thank you. That was my question.
Yeah, and let's just elaborate on that. You know, we're looking at everything within the urban growth boundary for Cannon Beach, but we did have to constrain the parking study a bit just because there was sampling involved and, you know, resources are limited. So we looked at the most critical parts of town based on feedback from the city, but the TSP does address the entire town.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Les, if just to speak to that though, Les, I when they asked my input on what the study areas for the parking could be, because they really had how many blocks, they gave us the staff kind of a number of blocks that they could sample and cover with accuracy under the funding that was available. And so we decided to concentrate on the Midtown and downtown areas. But I do recognize, I think with most citizens, that in our peak seasons or seasonal, that we're seeing more and more down at Tolovana area down there around that intersection with Warren Way, parking issues as well, and further south even into the neighborhood down there. And those are things that, you know, from your group or from the PAC, I hope you guys, you know, feel free to talk about and communicate with us that, hey, you know, these are important areas also to look at. And so I welcome that question. Thank you. And Barb, did you have something else?
No, I'm fine.
All right, thank you.
All right, folks. Well, if that's good for now, then perhaps we can just get through the next few slides. There's really, I think, only 4 left, and then there's another opportunity for discussion. So maybe we can just get through these next few if that works for everyone. So getting into the pedestrian system in town. So currently the land use pattern and overall design of the city of Cannon Beach is such that it's a compact and walkable place for the most part. And we also know that most of the walking and biking activity is really concentrated currently near the city's main commercial areas. And as you know, lots of people opt to walk and bike to get to the beach and to the parks in town. In those commercial areas, you see sidewalks, and most of those sidewalks have curb ramps, although the conditions may vary, which does raise an accessibility concern. And most of you probably also know that there aren't any signalized crossings in town currently. Outside of those commercial areas, though, you do have a lack of pedestrian facilities. So, for example, outside of those areas, you typically don't see sidewalks. And street lighting outside of those commercial areas is also limited, and they have actually factored in a crash, which I'll get into in a couple of slides. And lastly, the Cannon Beach Academy Public Elementary School does have a crosswalk near it, but no other dedicated pedestrian facilities. Next slide, please. In terms of biking, Cannon Beach currently lacks a designated bike network, meaning a designated route system for people to get around on bicycles, or a dedicated bike master plan, although this was called out as a policy priority, policy objective in the comprehensive plan. But of course, that doesn't mean that people don't bike in town or that there are no facilities in town. Many of you probably know that the Oregon Coast Bike Route does go through town on Hemlock Street, although that facility is inconsistent and drops out in a few points. As far as the opportunities for biking on US 101, currently that's limited, mainly because the shoulders on US 101 don't meet ODOT standards. Currently, the standard is a minimum of 6 feet in shoulder width to accommodate some space for cyclists, or 4 feet minimum in areas of physical constraints. And just generally, one of the kind of high-level findings that we found in our analysis was that north of First Street, you generally just see far fewer bicycle facilities as a whole. All right, and transit. So the TSP will also look at transit, of course, because it's an important tool for giving people other options for getting around, reducing traffic impacts, and also reducing parking demands. Currently, local service is provided by the Sunset Empire Transportation District, or SETD, and intercity service is available in town, and that's provided by a collection of different providers. So that would be SETD, Oregon Point, which is a coalition of transit providers that provide intercity service in Oregon, and some service by the Tillamook Transportation District, which operate the WAVE service. In our analysis, we found that transit might be an impractical option for some people that are trying to get around in ways other than a personal vehicle, primarily because of limited service hours and infrequent service. And also, we found that private transportation services such as taxis and hotel shuttles and things like that are currently limited in town. Next slide. And freight, of course, freight is super important to supporting the local economy. So therefore, the TSP will look at ways to maintain access to businesses while also assessing potential transportation improvements. And I think as a matter of practice, what this really kind of boils down to is ensuring that we're balancing the needs of other modes with preserving space for delivery trucks to safely load and unload their materials, or their cargo, I should say. And I think these are the last 2 slides. So just very quickly, a couple of highlights on safety. So, obviously safety is very important, not only because of the real implications on people's health and also impacts on property, but also because safety can really, and perceptions of safety can influence how people choose to get around the city. So we found that between 2014 and 2018, which was the last available data set that we had, There were 47 crashes that were reported within the Cannon Beach urban growth boundary. And like in many communities, we found that most of these crashes were concentrated on really just a couple of main facilities in town. So of those 47, 20 occurred on Hemlock Street and 14 were on US 101. Luckily, none of these crashes were fatal, but one of these crashes did lead to serious injuries and 6 of those led to minor injuries. And in terms of safety regarding or involving people walking or biking, we did find 2 crashes with that relationship. So one pedestrian involved crash occurred at the intersection of South Hemlock and Dawes Avenue. And I mentioned something about streetlights previously. The data does show that this crash occurred at night without streetlights. And the other being a crash involving a person biking, and that was also on South Hemlock at the intersection of Adams Avenue, resulting in minor injuries to the person biking.
And Lisa, do you have something?
Maybe not. It was on the last slide. So looking at the ledger there, it says red is a serious injury, but I don't see any red on this map, but then I see it on the other one. So I was that's originally when I raised my hand, was because I was asking about where the red one was on the
right.
first.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah. So the one is for this one right there at just below Haystack there. On 101.
Yeah. So Jeff, will you go to the previous slide? I just want to make sure.
Yeah. It says one crash led to serious injuries, I think is what Lisa was catching there.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't on this northern half, but there it is on 101, just below Haystack.
Yeah, that might have been a mapping flub. I will look into that and follow up with Jeff.
I think it's just the north. We just have the north.
Yeah,
and south.
I think it's accurate. Yeah.
Oh, it's just cut off. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, next time we'll make sure the map shows all the crashes that we're talking about. That'd be good. All right. Well, that was really it, folks. Thanks for bearing with me. So back to the discussion. Again, we framed this up at the beginning, but really the whole purpose of sharing this with you was to bring you up to speed on what we've done so far and to really get your feedback on whether or not these conditions are consistent with your experience living and working in Cannon Beach. And related to that, we want to know what's working, what isn't working, what the TSP ought to focus on and try to improve. And of course, is there anything missing in our analysis that we should be considering? So we do have until 10 o'clock. So please let us know what you think.
Well,
questions?
I will start it off just because I will reflect what people tell me at public meetings or call me up and just let you know what I hear is the main concerns that I have, I think, from the public, which most of the people in this room, the other staff members, are going to throw daggers at me for saying a lot of this. But anyhow, the ones is gravel, okay? The graveled streets, it presents problems to the elderly and people that don't have, that have to use wheelchairs or things to get around. And, I think that even people in the community, they love their gravel streets and they want to maintain the small gravel village feel, but that doesn't always work for everyone in our community. And I think when Gail and Lisa brought the mobility issues up earlier about, the aging and others, that is often issues that people bring up to me. The more signaling and signing is always brought up to me, that for parking and for crosswalks. I live on Ross Lane by Haystack, and I can't even walk my dog without people complaining to me about that crossing at Haystack, to the Haystack beach access on Hemlock. And I know that, there's been solutions thrown out over the years. It's brought up almost every year about striping and how we get, no parking and everything. It's just a very sensitive area, that and the S curves. But it is something that I don't think a week goes by in the summer where I don't get complaints about safety issues and incidents there. And really, from walking that at least 2 or 3 times a day, which I do, I am surprised and amazed that there aren't injuries there ever, because people come flying around that, and that crossing, you know, you see little kids getting pulled out of the way, and it is a dangerous place. So those are my 2 cents. I see Brian, you've got your hand raised.
I do. I got a couple concerns and questions. Will this also start looking at new traffic control options? Because my business is almost at the corner of Sunset and Hemlock, which is one of the biggest nightmares in the summer for people trying to turn left onto Hemlock. It will back stuff up out onto the highway, which obviously we will all find very dangerous. The second issue is one that I just had the other day, and I understand the freight issue, but Cannon Beach, to me, has no place for double trailers. And I had a Cisco truck the other day that had 2 trailers on it, parked a quarter of the way into my driveway, which then made it dangerous to get out onto Sunset. Is there any way in this transportation plan we're going to be able to say double trailers aren't allowed at Cannon Beach? It's just not.
Triple trailers are.
Yeah. So that's my 2.
Yeah, great. Good points there, Brian. Anyone else have some thoughts? Anyone from this room have concerns that are that bring up you here in the public?
Yeah, I got something here, and I sent this to Jeff, so we don't have to try to write this down or make a notation of it. He has this sent to him just in an email right now.
And this is Rick Hudson,
The emergency manager here. The concepts that I want to contact with or talk about before this is finished is something that not everybody thinks about, and it's okay not to think about that. And so the goals I have from my perspective are, first of all, ongoing access for emergency responders. As we talk about the village feel and we talk about how many parking spaces and like that, things get clogged up very quickly. And so unless we understand the need for emergency responders in every aspect of it, we're kind of selling it short. So that's one thing that goes into it. But with that, it even gets bigger than that, where you talk about rapid evacuation out of the city. So as you talk about a transportation plan, it's also how do we move people out of here fast? And so it's a multi-view focus for evacuation. The first focus is for locals, and the second focus is for visitors. The local focus is easy to educate because it's going to be something that's going to be commonplace. It's going to be around them all the time. With that being said, the visitors don't know anything of what we have in place. And so it has to be something that is very easily understood, and even understood with a simple sign or something on a broadcast. And so when you talk about evacuation, there's a couple things you need to think about evacuation. First of all, rapid evacuation. Rapid evacuation is something that you need to be done in about 20 minutes, or with only 20 minutes of notification. And that really is something that is a local earthquake and a local tsunami, where you have easy access from all of the parking areas and the walking areas to where they can easily see the tsunami evacuation routes and it not be blocked with any type of traffic whatsoever. And then people have to know not to utilize their vehicles. So it's almost like once you park your car and there's rapid evacuation is going to happen, your car's not moving. And that's something that's an education process, but it also has to be considered when we do this. The second thing with that is more of a, it's still rapid evacuation, but you have about 2 hours to deal with it. One is wildfire. If we have a wildfire incident, we have to find out a way to evacuate this entire city, and we have one thoroughfare out of 101. And so that's something that's a city and county concept of how we even organize that, but it does have to be considered in the traffic plan. How do you actually move all the vehicles into a certain area? And you need to be able to do it in about 2 hours. So it's wildfire and a distant earthquake that's going to cause a distant tsunami, where we have a little bit of time to make that determination to evacuate the city, but it has to be considered smartly when we come up with our plan. The last goal for me would be shelter in place. So not as much as a local, but more the visitors. If a visitor comes to town and we have a terrorism act and we need to shelter them in place, how is that also a concept of where they park their vehicles and where are those soft targets that we're considering? And that's a concept that really is not commonplace to consider. Because you have to realize Cannon Beach is an extreme soft target because there's so many people that come in here from so many other areas. And so the transportation is very critical, and where the parking area is very critical because we have to either move people or move people around and stage them. It's important that we put that into the end of the plan. And that's not always something that's commonplace. These are not something that's commonplace in what you guys are building and developing. So I just want to add to this at the end when we finish this process that we wash this through this filter of this emergency response. Some of it's fast, some of it's slow, but it has to be visible and it has to be considered something that you have to educate in a moment's notice, which is very, very hard to do.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I mean, this gets to public works and police as well. I mean, one of the things that we have to think with our little village footprint is Spruce Street is our perfect example. We really do not have, other than Highway 101, really kind of secondary routes to emergency locations in many instances. If we do not keep Spruce open for emergency access through these things. So I think that that's why I welcome thinking of resiliency as just part of that planning spectrum and incorporating that in and having Rick as part of this, and look forward to his input and Jason's to plan this going forward. Gail, did you have something?
Yeah, I just had a question more for my own information than anything, but I'm sure there's probably a history, but has Cannon Beach looked at doing some sort of tourist shuttle along connecting the different downtown areas that would assist visitors and maybe help reduce some of that on-street parking crunch?
I know that there currently runs a shuttle, and it's a seasonal shuttle. And if Jeff Hazen, I don't know if Jeff ever joined us or not, but maybe Greg can speak to it, someone from the chamber or Karen. But I don't know where that route is, but we do have some form of trolley. But one of the things that Michael and I spoke even back at the application phase of this is that many times in public meetings and others through Cannon Beach's last few years, a offsite parking, seasonal parking with trolley to connect with this trolley system has been mentioned for peak as one of those management solutions. But I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to that, Karen or Greg or.
Greg could probably speak to it better than I.
Greg?
Been around so long.
Well, I mean, on that topic, you're right. It does get brought up, and people have mentioned things that aren't possible yet, like Southwind or maybe down at the junction to incorporate that. But we do have the seasonal trolley, which I believe goes from the Chamber building to Midtown and then down to Tolovana and Wayside area throughout the height season, which is getting a little bit longer each year. But we've never really, there's nothing has taken off on a centralized park and ride type of situation, whether it be funding or a place to do that. But it does get discussed often. The reason I raised my hand is I wanted to kind of dovetail onto what Brian said about the double trailers. I live on the corner of 2nd and Larch, right across from Insomnia Coffee, right in the heart of all those red zones you put up on your maps for parking. And it starts at 5 in the morning with delivery trucks dropping off food and so forth. And then it's the employees that all start parking in the morning. And then it is the early day trippers that take all those spots, and without a 3-hour spots, they're there all day. And I don't know, it was about 5 years ago, the city kind of brought that up, and the 3-hour time limit got poo-pooed, didn't go anywhere. And my understanding is anybody who's ever done parking studies will tell you that a vibrant turnover for a downtown area is good for the commerce of the area and the value of that parking space and so forth. But to kind of go on to what Brian said, I'm a big advocate of the type of parking, and like the double trailer trucks, the communication and wayfinding for campers, RVs, high profile vehicles that are now, you're seeing Sprinter vans that are about 18, 20 feet high now that are parked on the downtown corridor that you can literally be sitting at the Driftwood and not see Bill's Tavern because you have these vehicles, and it makes the access of getting on and off, like from the post office or Mariner Market or other businesses, very dangerous and difficult to be pulling out onto Hemlock. And we have some signs that say go park over by the sewer ponds or in these designated areas for RVs, trailers, campers, and so forth. But I guess throughout this process, I would like to see some solutions that are industry wide for proactive communication in doing such kind of things, whether it be like you see at the airport where level 3 parking only has one more space, go to level 4, or geocaching type of proactive communication, not geocaching, geofencing, kind of proactive communication, or even billboards at the exits, just letting people know what to do. So I'm very interested in the technologies that other places are using as best practices to kind of control that. And that's my 2 cents.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Paul?
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry I missed introductions, but I'm with Sunset Empire Transportation. I'm sitting in for Jeff Hazen, who was unable to attend today, and I just wanted to make sure that we were represented, and he made some comments about the current shuttle. Weekday shuttle starts today, as a matter of fact, and runs through Cannon Beach about every half an hour from 11 in the morning till almost 6 o'clock. But if there are any other questions that I can answer, I'd be glad to. Otherwise, we're glad to be at this table.
Thank you, Paul. Are you sitting on the shuttle now?
No, the shuttle has no windows, so this ain't it.
Well, I think we're getting close to our time. I don't know, Eddie, Ryan, if what the general practice is. Do you keep it running if there's more questions or anything? But I don't see any current hands up.
I have a couple things I want to talk about.
What's that?
Well, I have a couple things.
Okay.
Jason Scrimore, the police chief. As I hate to do it, I agree with Brian on the intersection there at Sunset and Hemlock. That's one of our main concerns with the police department, where we're directing traffic, often tying up a police officer, and there's really nowhere to put people. Even when we're directing traffic there, they still have to slow down and stop on Hemlock for pedestrians. So that's just a huge headache, but it's more concerning when it backs up onto the highway and people are passing and trying to get through. So I think that would be one of our biggest headaches. But also I like the ideas of marking the parking spots downtown. I know that's been a conversation for the 9 years I've been here, just that you will get people parking efficiently and opening up more spots for parking.
Great. Yeah.
Thanks for those comments about that. Just want to mention, this conversation is super helpful because, for example, on the traffic, we run software and use traffic counts to simulate conditions to understand where there are issues, but it doesn't always, capture everything, right? So like the issue we're talking about here at Sunset and Hemlock, it's good to know about this.
Part of that on Hemlock, I thought that they were going to put a sidewalk there where people are always parking up there.
Where's
what happened with that on the west side of Hemlock heading up to the S-curves?
Where we have no parking right now?
Yeah, it's a no parking area, but it's also a bike lane. I thought they were going to put a sidewalk in there to help with people parking there.
As long as I know, they've never had a sidewalk plan
Never
there.
had one, but I've never heard that. But
The only new sidewalk plan was up by the conference center as far as the entire town.
Okay.
That was the only one that's been on the map for a while.
Yeah, doesn't surprise me. Dan made it up.
all right. Well, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Jeff. I was just going to say that, just being a little bit of a time cop here, we do have 2 minutes left. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if people want to chat. But Jeff, I was going to suggest maybe you run us through the last slide just to make sure we cover that information.
Yeah. Yeah, so first off, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and being part of this. Yeah, and then you can send anything, including these questions here, but any comments you get or any things you think about, what's working well, what are issues that you see or something that we missed in any of these discussions. And please help us get the word out about the open house. Webinar is tonight, but please direct people to cannonbeachtsp.com for information and links to that webinar. And I will be posting, we will keep trying to get the information out online through posters this week, whatever it takes to get that word out. And again, I think this is maybe the best turnout I've ever had on a advisory committee. I think we have all but maybe 2 members that are on that list that did not sign, that were on our invitees list that didn't tune in. And I'm sure with summer coming on that's part of it. And this is officially the longest I've gone without coffee. And I think having that 8:30 meeting and having to go to 10, that's difficult, but I do appreciate everybody joining us and being part of this.
Thank you.
And Jeff, I would just add for the group that, in addition to helping us get the word out on the online open house, it would be great if you participated as well. There, it's an interactive format of a lot of the same information that we just went over today, but there's also a survey component that allows you to provide some feedback in kind of a standardized way. So it would be great if you could participate in that and share it with your friends and family. So
yeah,
please do that.
And there's also a component on our TSP site, the cannonbeachtsp.com, where you can join the mail list. So direct people that are interested in transportation or that you've heard talk about parking or traffic or transportation or trails, just direct them to that site and have them sign up. And that way they get a push notification on all these meetings, all these new materials that we'll be producing over the next year. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.